I never wanted to become a priest. I actually thought becoming a priest would be a fate worse than death. And so when I was young, in elementary school, they asked me, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? I didn't know, and so two occupations came to mind. First was to become a veterinarian. My dad's a vet, so that made sense. And the second was to become a firefighter. Two completely different occupations, both very respectable. But I didn't know what to do. I went off to university, started the science degree. At one point, I was thinking about becoming an engineer, another point, a doctor. And finally, in the midst of that, through a series of surprising spiritual events, I joined the seminary. That was September 2001. And I began to pursue the call to priesthood. And so for those of you who are good at math, that was about 20 years ago. I just celebrated my 40th birthday. So literally half of my life has been either preparing for or living out the vocation to priesthood. And to be honest, it's not as bad as they said it was going to be. I actually don't mind it. I love being a priest, in fact, and I've been so inspired by so many amazing priests over the years, not the least of which Father Bob Bedard, who I talk about, the founder of my community, and so many other men who are wise and holy, guys who are athletic and funny, who can preach, good men. And, I know I make fun of Father Alex quite a bit. He's not here today, so don't tell him I said this, but Father Alex is a great priest. And he totally inspires me, along with many others. And so I'm asking myself the question, why is it that I don't talk about vocations to the priesthood more? We're in this series on vocations, Your Calling. And Deacon David, as well as Father Alex, have both talked about these various vocations, to marriage, to priesthood, to single life, to religious life. And it's not that one is objectively better than another. It's about what is God calling you to in your life. And it's about surrendering and saying yes to whatever that may be. Now, it just so happens that I'm most familiar with the call, the vocation to priesthood. That's what I am. But as I say, I've done very little, even over the last 6 years at St. Benedict, to encourage or promote vocations to the priesthood. And it's like, why is that? Because I believe that God is still calling today young men to follow him as priests. He's calling young women to religious life, to sisterhood, just as he's calling people to be single for him, and he's calling couples to enter into the sacred union of marriage. And yet, especially priesthood and religious life, it's a bit countercultural today. And I find it awkward speaking about these vocations because of all the headlines. And sadly, we've been hearing again and again negative things, even scandalous things about priests and religious. You're familiar with the clergy sex abuse crisis. And by the way, that's not done with. Even here in our archdiocese, we're in the midst of a class action lawsuit. And I think we're going to be hearing about this at least for the next couple of years. Just recently, in the last week or so, maybe you heard about the Vatican financial crisis, which is being exposed, finally. And for those of us here in Canada, the residential school crisis. Crisis upon crisis. And this last one, in these last 2 months, I think for many of us who are both Canadian and Catholic, we're coming to understand in a deeper way the impact of the Indian residential schools and how the church was involved, played a role in this whole dark history. Now, this week, I had a beautiful conversation with an Indigenous person. We talked for well over an hour, and at the end of it, we had a chance to pray together. It was so beautiful. I'm so grateful. This person was sharing, it's not just that there were a few bad apples, and there certainly were priests and religious who perpetrated abuse. But he said, even more than that, it's that the whole system was rotten. It was wrong. It was rooted in racism because, one people group was being oppressed by another people group because of the way they looked, because of their culture, because of their language. It was wrong. And so we find ourselves mired in another church scandal. And I feel very, very awkward talking about vocations to the priesthood. It's like crazy to say, hey, you young people, think about joining the institution that is responsible for hurting people in the past, that was complicit. Or parents, encourage your children to become priests and nuns. It seems crazy. You know, in the face of all this news of the residential schools, I've witnessed two primary reactions among Catholics. And the first is this. It's to distance ourselves from the institution. And I understand that. I mean, there's so many people outside who are defining for us what it means to be a member of the Catholic Church. And it's pretty ugly. There's a lot of shame associated with that. And I know people who have stopped giving, people who have stopped going to church because of these scandals. Now, I think back to one experience when I was newly ordained, 2009, the Bishop Lahi scandal just broke, and I was in Ottawa. Those of you in Atlantic Canada, I'm sure you felt it much more acutely. But I remember every time we celebrated Mass, we had this prayer for vocations to the priesthood, and we'd pray it at the end of Mass. And this one day, a lady came up to me in the foyer, and quite aggressively, she was like, I refuse to pray for vocations until the church cleans up her act. And I realized there was so much emotion there, and there was this kind of distancing from the church. That's one reaction. Another reaction is to defend the church. And even when I was speaking to this Indigenous person who is a faithful Catholic, they said, you know what, in the past, so often I've rushed to the defense of the church when bad things have been exposed. And they realized, you know what, I can't do this time. People are grieving, they're hurting. And even in my own effort to try to understand, to wrap my head and my heart around what happened, to understand the context, at times I've found myself wanting to defend the church. Well, what's been your response? Have you distanced yourself? Have you tried to defend the church? I mean, these are basic instincts. Another words for these would be flight and fight. I love this image of the birds, right? They're doing both at the same time. They're fighting in flight. And maybe we oscillate between these two. See, when we feel afraid or threatened, when we feel ashamed and angry, we're grieving, we either want to run away or we want to fight. And I just wonder, once we have those initial reactions, is there a godly way that we can respond? And today I want to look to our very sobering text from Jeremiah 23. Listen to this. Woe to you shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. It is you who have scattered my flock and have driven them away, and you have not attended to them. So I will attend to you for your evil doings. Wow, that is so relevant. It could have been a message written for 2021. Another translation, woe to you shepherds who have butchered the flock. A few things that I glean from this passage. Here's 4 quick things. Number 1 is this. God sees everything. God is not unaware of the hurt, of the pain of victims. God is not somehow blind to the misdeeds, to the grave sins of shepherds. God sees everything. Number 2, shepherds were actively destroying the flock. It's not just that some of the leaders were sleeping on the job or they missed a shift. They were a little bit negligent. No, they were responsible for actively destroying and scattering the sheep. Number 3, God is the ultimate judge. And this is a really important point that we have to understand. We have this image of God when it suits us, that he's, kind and loving, all merciful, this sort of spiritual softy in the sky. Well, listen to his words here as he says this. You have not attended to them, and so I am going to attend to you. And, I just think every single bishop and priest and nun and layperson and government policymaker who is involved with perpetrating evil and sinful things with regards to the residential schools, they will have to answer to God for their behavior. Now, I don't say that with any delight, as if to say oh yeah, they're going to get what's coming to them. No, because as a priest, I know that I myself will have to one day go before the judgment seat of God. And every single one of you, whatever your vocation, whether you're married or single or religious or a priest, you will one day have to answer to God in eternity for all of your actions. And it's not that cut and dry, like the good people are here and the bad people are here. And I'll speak for myself, but good and evil both exist in my heart. And I'm on this journey of repenting, trying to receive God's forgiveness. And I feel like I'm a really slow learner. I want my life to look like the life of Jesus, but it's baby steps for me. God is the judge. Number 4, God is not surprised by our capacity for evil. And I don't want this to sound trite, but this isn't the first time that God has had to deal with bad shepherds. There were huge mistakes made in the 19th century, in the 20th century, still today. Just as Jesus in the first century was calling out, chastising the religious leaders of his day. Just as 600 years before Christ in Jeremiah's day, God was calling out the shepherds who were messing everything up. God is not surprised by our capacity for evil. He sees the evil. He is the ultimate judge. But here's the good news. He doesn't leave us hanging. And here's the word I think we need to hear. We need to keep reading the text. Listen to this. God says, "Then I myself will gather the remnant of my flock. I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply." See, God realized there's no human up to the task. So he said, I'm going to be the shepherd. We sang that in our psalm today. The Lord is my shepherd. God sent his son, Jesus, to earth to be the new shepherd, the good shepherd. When I was talking to this indigenous person, I said, tell me, what can I possibly say that would help? And they said 2 things. One is acknowledge the truth of what happened. And I've tried to do that. I wrote a letter in early June. It's on our website. I wrote a follow-up in our Benedictus just last week. I hope you've read those things. I know they're imperfect. They're lacking. But it's an attempt to acknowledge the truth. And secondly is, and this is from this indigenous person, go back to the basics. Remind people of who Jesus is. And I want to go on record as saying this. Jesus is the good shepherd. He is the new shepherd. And if you are hurting, whether you're indigenous or not, if you feel scattered, if you're grieving, Jesus wants to be your shepherd. He wants to pick you up and care for you right where you are. And I'm reminded of that line in the Gospels in John chapter 10, where he says, "My sheep hear my voice. My sheep hear my voice." You see, the instinct is to run to either distance ourselves from the institution, either to defend the church, but I wonder if there's a third option. We can discern God's voice. It's actually possible to listen and to hear God speaking to us above all the noise. So often when bad stuff happens, our instinct is to say, well, I need to find out what is CBC saying. or what is CTV, or CNN, or I got to find out what is being said on Facebook or on Twitter. And yeah, we have to be informed, but we need to train ourselves to ask God, what are you saying? My sheep hear my voice. You see, there's so much of this kind of, and it troubles me on social media. People are taking in information in media and then firing back opinions, and nobody's listening. I think we need to lead by listening for the voice of God. You might ask Jesus questions like this: what are you saying to me? Jesus, how do you understand this whole situation? Jesus, what do you want me to do? God is speaking to us. My sheep hear my voice. God is speaking to us, and it's possible for us to hear his voice. Sometimes we hear his voice in the quiet of our hearts. Sometimes we hear his voice through the Bible, just as even in our passage today from Jeremiah 23, we can hear God speaking to us. And sometimes we hear God's voice through other people. And I want to give us a chance to try to hear God speaking to us as a parish family. I would like to invite you to join us. We're going to gather this week, this Thursday evening at 7:30. I didn't know what to call it. I called it a listening session, a chance for us to come together to process all this heavy news that we've been hearing, to share, to listen, and most importantly, to pray. We might have this flight or fight instinct hardwired into us. But one of the things that separates us from the animal kingdom is that we can discern. We can hear. We were made for relationship with God, which means we can talk to him, he can talk to us, we can hear him speaking to us. And maybe discerning, listening is like one of those underdeveloped spiritual muscles. But let me tell you something. It is going to serve us so well to train to grow in this area. And I want to circle back to our topic of vocations, because discernment is so important. Hearing the voice of God when it comes to vocations is so key. And I want to speak to young people, to teenagers, to young adults, to anybody, in fact, who's asking the question, what am I supposed to do with my life? I don't know. God, what are you calling me to? I want to speak to people who are in their vocation, but you're struggling. You're struggling to persevere in what God has called you to. I want to speak to you and say this clearly. God has a plan for your life. God has a plan for your life, and it's a good plan. He's calling you to a vocation. And it may not be a life of ease, but it's a life of greatness. He's calling you to something that will be meaningful, that will fulfill you. When I look to this passage we have today, I keep reading and I see this. Jesus says, God says, I will raise up shepherds, plural. So not only is Jesus the good shepherd, I will raise up shepherds over them who will shepherd them. And they shall not fear any longer or be dismayed, nor shall any be missing. And I think of all the children that are gone missing. Well, God is saying he's not okay with that. He wants to remove fear. He wants to seek and save the lost. God wants to raise up a new generation of leaders who will work with Jesus to make things right. And I know that God is calling people today. If you're a young man, God might be calling you to discern a vocation to the priesthood, to serve the church, to celebrate the sacraments in a special way in the person of Christ. If you're a young woman, God might be calling you to discern a vocation to religious life, to be a sister, to be wedded to Jesus for your whole life long in this special way. God is calling people to discern a vocation to be single for him. That some people, you're not meant to be distracted, you're not meant to have your heart divided, but you are to live in the world, but not of the world, so as to be a witness for Jesus. God is calling people to discern a vocation to the covenants of marriage, where a man and a woman will sacrifice for one another, will raise up children, shepherding them in the ways of Jesus. Yes, we're living through a difficult time as Canadians and as Catholics. But it's not the time to run away, to distance ourselves, nor is it appropriate to defend what is indefensible. God is raising up a new generation of leaders who can help to make things right. He's looking for brave men and women who will listen for his voice, who will say yes to follow wherever he calls.